Mary Poole, take one. Mary, I'm mostly interested in talking about your shipyard experiences, but some of the things you told me about what you were doing before then are real interesting to set the period. Tell me a little bit about what it was like in 1940 when you were looking for a job. Were there jobs around?
Not very many, particularly for a beginning high school teacher.
So you had just graduated from teacher college, right?
I had just graduated from, well, I graduated from college in '39, but then I did a year of, to get my credential. In California, you had to do 5 years rather than 4. So I had just got my credential. I had the worst possible combination of major and minor, history and English. And in those days, they'd have the football coaches teach history. So it was pretty hard getting a job.
And you would have gotten a job at home if you could have, but you went farther.
Oh, yeah, there were no jobs in Marin County. I traveled all over California looking for a teaching job.
And
I ended up in Galt.
Now that was a rural community.
Very rural, yes.
And in those days, we still had a lot of people coming in, the folks who were looking for work in the valley. What was it like teaching those kids?
Well, we had many migrant workers. There were camps around there, and we would have them for part of the year, and then they'd move on to wherever else the farm work was.
And what
they were way behind in school, poor kids. Usually had large families. I was assigned a class in remedial reading, believe it or not. This was in high school. And most of them were in that class. Wasn't their fault. They were moving around so much they had very little schooling.
So they wouldn't even be in the class the whole year, would they?
No. Mm-mm.
Stop for a second. One thing. Take two. So you'd finished a year as a school teacher, and that was what you trained to do, and from there you went into the shipyards. What made you decide to do that, or what had you heard about that work?
I finished 2 years as a school teacher. It was 42 when I went into the shipyard. And the main reason was that the shipyard was right across from the bay from where I lived and easily accessible. And my brother was in the Navy on the Saratoga, the aircraft carrier Saratoga. And teaching in a little country town seemed rather removed from the war effort. So I got a job as a welder.
Because you told me before that it wasn't really a question of more money, it was that you wanted to do something.
Yeah, that was, I did. I wanted to do something for the war effort. Mm-hmm. Whether it was more money or not, I don't really remember. I think it probably was.
People don't sort of understand that now, how much the country pulled together during the war. I mean, it's different than today, isn't it?
It was very different during the war. This is an entirely different country. Believe me, entirely different.
What was that mood like?
Well, it was a mood of pulling together, a mood of working together, of doing everything you could, building the ships as fast as we could.
And that was a sense that was what you could do to contribute, right?
I figured it was all I could do. I had tried to get into the waves and the wax and the Marines, the whole bit. And for some reason, I couldn't pass their physical. But I've lasted 52 years since then, so I guess it wasn't too bad.
Well, I've heard that the shipyards needed so many workers that really they were willing to take just about anyone who could walk. And
They sent recruiters out all over the country. That's why so many of them came from the South, the Middle West. I would say South and Middle West mostly. Some of them from the East. But yes, they recruited madly.
Because it took a lot of people to build a ship, right? How many people were working there?
I don't know.
Lots, right?
That's a long time ago, and I've forgotten those statistics. There were a lot.
Well, one of the things you do remember, because you told us before, was this funny story about trying to figure out what it meant to join a union and going down to the union meeting. And tell me that story.
Oh, well, there were many women welders, and more were coming in. Suddenly, the powers that be in the Boilermakers Union, which is what the welders had to join, decided that they wouldn't allow the women to join. But then on the other hand, they wouldn't allow you to work unless you were in the union. So there was a little bit of an impasse there for a while. And finally, they decided to let the women in. So we joined. We paid our dues, very small dues. And a bunch of us decided to go to the next union meeting. So we went over there in a group of a dozen or 15 or so to somewhere in San Francisco. I've forgotten where. And there was no one else there except the three fellows who ran the union. And they saw us walk in and sit down. And they were so horrified at the fact that there were all these people at their union meeting that they canceled the meeting. And I could tell you the name of the fellow who was, but I don't think I will.
But they didn't expect you to show up, did they?
Oh, no. I don't think anyone had ever shown up in a meeting. And to see all these women walk in, that was just too much. Cancel the meeting. That was the last time we ever
Well, I guess
tried.
I figured there was no point going to the meetings because they'd cancel them.
Nope.
How are we doing on this magazine?
A minute.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what it felt actually to go to work once you'd been through welding school. What it felt like to be on one of those big docks working on a ship, and what was that like? It was really different, wasn't it, from being a school teacher?
Well, working on I never worked on the docks. I was lucky. I was out in what they call the skids in the sub-assembly shop, where they put the parts together. It was different, but I have always been very adaptable. And within a week, it seemed like home. But it was always very exciting. Very exciting. People from all over the country, lots of noise, all kinds of things going on. It was a wonderful job.
And how was the atmosphere there? Are we out? All right, Poole, take 3. Mary, I guess a good place to pick up was where we were talking a little bit before. People who didn't live it through it have this sense that the Depression ended and then the war began. What really happened? How did it end?
The war began and then the Depression ended.
Well, for this
That was the sequence.
Was
the
the
Depression.
Depression ever going to end? Did you have a feeling towards those days that if the war hadn't come along?
Well, I don't know. We all had great hope and faith in Roosevelt and his New Deal and all of that kind of thing. And of course, the war had started in Europe 2 years before, and some businesses were getting back on their feet because of that, selling ammunitions and everything to Europe. But as far as my friends were concerned, there was still a depression until Pearl Harbor happened. And then you could get a job anywhere. Anybody could get a job anywhere.
Let's talk a little bit about the coming of war in those years before Pearl Harbor, before we were involved. Were you and your friends? Did you think we were going to be involved in a war, or did you favor it? Were you opposed to it?
Well, I was waiting for us to be involved in the war because I had read Hitler's Mein Kampf in German when I was at Marin Junior College. And I knew what his plans were, but most people in the United States didn't seem to think that he was ever intending to come over here. Isolationism was the thing in the late 30s. In fact, in the school I taught in, it was mainly German and Japanese, that is, descendants of German and Japanese, and Italians. And of course, Germans and the Italians were the Axis, and their parents influenced them, There was no. Apparently, they didn't really think what Hitler was. They didn't know what we know now about what he was doing, or else they turned their backs on it. I don't remember. My parents, my ancestors were all English. So, of course, I'd been involved in the war since 1939. But I don't think the United States would have got in it for years, if ever, if it hadn't been Pearl Harbor. That was the big mistake.
When you were, as you said, you had these children from these different groups, these different countries. Was that a subject that you would discuss with them about the war? Did that ever come up in school? Did the kids talk about it? Or would you say, today, class, we're going to talk about foreign affairs? And
No, we didn't do it formally like that. But in discussions, you could figure out how they felt. And it wasn't just the people there. It was all around me. I had a lot of Italian friends. They all said it's Italy's and Germany's turn this time.
So people really, when they thought about the war, they didn't think about Japan, did they?
Japan. Well, the fellows who'd been in the Merchant Marine did, and thought about Japan. And at the time, my boyfriend was in the Merchant Marine, and he told me about how the United States was selling scrap metal to Japan. He said it's going to come back as bombs. So I was worried about them. And of course, I can't say for very many people.
Yeah. You were saying that actually you and your boyfriend went to the fair once and you noticed the Japanese pavilion, and that was when it came up. Right? Does that ring a bell? Out at Treasure Island?
Well, I do remember noticing the Japanese pavilion. He probably said something about it, and I probably reacted to what he said. But I can't remember exactly what our feelings were towards Japan. I know Pearl Harbor was a terrific surprise, although it shouldn't have been.
Before we talk about what happens after Pearl Harbor, let's talk a little bit about the fair. You went a few times and just spent some time there. You didn't work there, but you visited. What was that like? What was the fair like?
Oh, the fair was wonderful. I didn't go as many times as I wanted to because I didn't have the money. I mean, the fair was in 1939, which to me was the height of the Depression. I was still in school. It was glorious. There was one thing that was really fascinating, and that was the thing the telephone company had. It was a model of a man, and he talked. I don't know how they did it, but it was. I remember he said, what was it that he said? Something about something was necessary. So is experience. Now, how they did it, I don't know. It was something putting sounds that the telephone company could make together. That was the most popular exhibit, I think, at the fair. You just had people with their mouths open watching this guy. Voter, I think they called him, the voter. And he could talk. Not very much, a few sentences, but he could talk.
And he had that funny sound, right?
Yeah. Then another thing the telephone company had, they'd give you free calls, long-distance calls. Now, in those days, long distance was very expensive. Now it's cheaper than short distance. And I wanted to make a long-distance call, and I didn't know anybody to call. Excuse me. So I didn't.
I mean, the fair has this sort of fantasy land. It looks, when we see pictures of it now, it looks like the Wizard of Oz or something, doesn't it?
I don't really remember what the theme was.
Yeah.
But it just seems strange that San Francisco had the International Exposition in 1915 and then got into a war, and then they had it in 1939 and got into another war. Maybe they better not have expositions in San Francisco anymore.
Could be dangerous.
But you went by ferry boat to the fair. There was no other way. Well, you could have gone. I guess a lot of people went on the bridge. But that was a nice trip, too. It was just a lot of fun. Kind of got you away from the depression.
Like a breath of fresh
Mm-hmm.
air.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move back to what happened after we got involved in the war, the Pearl Harbor. Do you remember anything about the day when you heard the news? What you were doing or where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it was a Sunday, and my father and mother and sister and I were getting ready to go to church. Excuse me, not my father. He didn't go. And we never turned a radio on, so we knew nothing about it until there was a knock on the door, and our neighbor, Mrs. Bowman, had run over in great distress, and she just yelled, "The Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor," and ran back again. Well, our hearts went through our boots because my brother was on the Lexington at the time, which was supposed to be in Pearl Harbor. And then the reports came that they'd bombed everything there, and 5 ships were sunk, and it got worse and worse and worse. But finally, about 2 weeks later, we got a card, a form card. They had them hastily printed where the guys could check off what the situation was. And you could say that you were injured, or you were okay, or you were sick. There wasn't anything for you were dead, obviously. And he was okay. But we didn't find out till he got home what had actually happened. They had, the Lexington had been moored there and was intending to stay there. He was supposed to have liberty that Sunday. And all of a sudden on Friday they said, okay, cancel all leaves and liberties. We're going out, and they went out to sea.
That must have been an incredible 2 weeks before you found out.
It was a very incredible 2 weeks, yeah. And the fellow next door, unfortunately, had been on the Arizona. And he was killed. He's still there on the Arizona. It was a very bad time, but it was an exciting time.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you got the good news, and that.
Yeah, that made it a little better, but that didn't really stop the worry. I mean, you got a member of your family on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. It was worry all the time.
Was he on the carrier the whole war?
No, he transferred to the Saratoga, then the Lexington got sunk, so I'm glad he transferred. And then he was there for 2 years in the Pacific. And then all of a sudden they came in through the Golden Gate. They came home. And from then on, I don't think he went back. He was a teacher. He taught some kind of thing, radar or something. It was funny how he became a radar man. He'd been a carpenter. And you'd expect that he would remain something of that nature. And poor guy, had these big, thick fingers and everything. And his
people told me about that telephone exhibit.
Oh, really?
There was another one where they recorded your voice and played it back to you.
Yeah.
People thought that was really
Yeah. Can you imagine that? That was something really astonishing, to have your voice recorded and played back to you. Now every little kid has a tape player. Yeah, it was something.
Tell me that thing you just said before we started again about once the war was on, going out of the shipyard and looking at the newspapers every day. Tell me that story again. About how you'd go out every day and just get ready to look at the headlines to see what.
Oh, how do you want my complete sentence to
Just
start?
say I'd go out every day when I came out of the shipyards.
Excuse me.
That's okay.
Okay. Well, every day when I left the shipyard, that was when I was on the day shift, I'd go out through the gates, and there would be newspaper racks with their blaring headlines. And I would have to brace myself to look at them because you never knew what might have happened. I thought it would say Saratoga sunk or Britain falls or something like that. It was, I think it really was a very stressful thing that we didn't realize at the time. There was always a worry. No matter what you were doing, in the back of your mind, you were worried about something. At least I was, and I guess most people were.
And up until the end of the war, there was really no sense that it was an easy victory or anything else like that, was it? I mean, it was in the balance, right? We could have lost, couldn't we? Do you think?
Well, the sailors all said the only reason we didn't lose was that the Japs were more fouled up than we were. You don't need to quote me on
No, it's okay. But
I
when
think.
you have the sense of tension.
Well, for instance, you take what happened in Africa. Rommel's Corps chased the British back, then they chased Rommel back, then the back and forth, and you had that feeling that it was never going to end, or that you were going to lose. I never really thought we were going to lose, but I thought it was going to be a long, long war.
But yeah,
which it was.
It's sort of interesting coming out of the Depression. The Depression had been this one kind of strain, and then the war sort of kept up the pressure. It wasn't like everything's fine just because you had a job, right?
Oh, of course not. I mean, yes, the Depression was a quite different kind of strain on you. The war changed it, but it was still there. They talk about the stress of modern business, flying around in airplanes and all of that kind of stuff. People should have lived through the Depression and the war. They would know why so many people died of heart attacks afterwards. And yet you can look back at it as a very interesting time, a very nice time in a way, because of the way that people were working together and just being good citizens. It didn't seem to me there was any split of any kind at that time. I hate to say it, but I kind of enjoyed it.
It wasn't all bad.
No, it wasn't all bad. Of course, I was here where it was fairly safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun in the shipyard.
Now, let's go back a little bit to right after Pearl Harbor. What was it like in San Francisco and the Bay Area the next day?
I don't have the foggiest notion.
You said that was.
I wasn't here.
Weren't you in Oakland?
See, it was.
Did you say that was in Oakland?
No, I had gone back to teach in Galt.
Oh, I see.
See, it happened on a Sunday, and I had to go back on Sunday night.
Mm-hmm.
And so by Monday morning, which would be the next day, I was up in.
But where was that blackout?
That was in the Oakland bus station.
Uh-huh.
I used to go back by. People need their cars to go everywhere these days. To get back to Galt, I would take. The ferries were gone by then. I'd take a bus to San Francisco, and then another bus to Oakland, and then a bus to Tracy, and transfer in Tracy to a bus to Galt. I never thought anything of it.
Tell me a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit after Pearl Harbor. The last time we were talking, you said that people really didn't understand how afraid people were that other things would happen, that there might be an invasion. I'm talking about the period where the Japanese were taken out of the West Coast and put in the camps. And you said you couldn't understand that unless you were there, that people really were afraid. What was that like?
Well, I would say that most people who were around here at the time the Japanese were moved into the internment camps, most people agreed that that was the thing to do because they were afraid. Although every single one of us had a Japanese friend that we were sure was never going to do anything, was perfectly loyal, and we would try to keep those people here. But you can't understand it unless you lived through it. You really can't understand it. Now it seems like a dreadful thing to do. But we didn't know. I mean, all of a sudden this attack had come. We didn't know. It was obvious that somebody was telling them where the warships were and all of that kind of thing. I don't think we realized that I didn't know at the time that so many of the Japanese lost their businesses and had to sell their land and whatever it was at such a loss. That was definitely unfair. But as for the rest of it, we were frightened. We were. Here we were on the West Coast. Japan had managed to reach Pearl Harbor. They could easily, somehow or other, reach the West Coast. And I'm sure that's why the whole thing happened.
It was real. Okay, sure. Take 5. One other comment you'd mentioned before was this worry that people were photographing things. The Japanese always had cameras, and did that seem like a real part of the fear that they might?
It was true that whenever you saw a Japanese tourist, you saw a camera. I never had a camera. Of course, I was never a tourist either. But I don't think anybody thought anything of it at the time. But after the war started, people started saying, well, they all had cameras. And, they were taking pictures of Hamilton Field and Fort Mason and all the rest of the places around San Francisco. They probably weren't. Maybe some of them were. But the feeling was still there. They did have all these cameras. And so I'm sure that was part of what happened, why they were rounded up, sent to the camps.
I think there was a period actually at the end of December where all the Japanese had to turn in their cameras. Do you remember?
I don't remember that, no.
They had to turn in their
I
cameras.
don't remember that. That might have happened. Yeah.
Let's move on to some general stuff. Looking back at the Depression and at what Roosevelt did, what are your feelings about his role in getting us through that period? What do you think? What did you think of Roosevelt then?
Well, at first, I thought Roosevelt was wonderful. I mean, he was our hero. And he did do a lot of things that helped during the Depression. I mean, that's where Social Security started. And he had the WPA and the other things with all the initials. He had the, Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which put a lot of young fellows to work in, even from Belvedere. People say Belvedere and Tiburon didn't feel the Depression, but they don't know what they're talking about. And most of the young men who graduated from high school had to get jobs with the CCC. And afterwards, many years later, I used to wonder about what Roosevelt did and whether those steps did any good at all. But they kept people from being completely starving. They did give some kind of jobs. One of our neighbors worked on the WPA.
Did they give people a sense of hope, that government cared about them?
Roosevelt certainly did, in his fireside chats over the radio and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, they had. I'm sure that we felt that the government cared about us at that time. Not now.
Of course, it's different from saying they cared to saying that they could really solve it, because it didn't get solved.
No, we always had the people who said anyone who wants a job can get one, and that problem hasn't been solved yet. I mean, we still, the ones who told me that in the 30s who are still alive are still telling me that. That's why I say I don't know whether government aid does solve a thing like a depression. I don't know what causes a depression in the first place. Of course, ours was caused by the stock market crash, but there was a depression all over the world at the same time.
But you don't want to say that a war solves a depression either, do you?
Well, war didn't solve it. That's not the right word to use. It ended it, but it didn't solve it. I got a good job. Everybody got a good job. But that's not the way to end a depression.
Are we on? So, we're out. I'd like to hear a little more about a couple of things on in your experiences when you were at Marine Ship working. Everybody all of a sudden, I mean, you had a little more money, but some people had a lot more money than they ever had. You told us some stories about how people would go out and what they'd spend their money on. What would people do with their paychecks?
Well, many of the people would go over to San Francisco after cashing their paychecks, and a great many of the women went over and bought hats. I can remember them telling me about the wonderful hats they had bought. What they spent their money on, I don't know, but they didn't keep it. I remember when I had a crew of welders, there was a woman named Bessie Blaney, and she had a daughter who lived with her. Bessie was from the Middle West, and she had been named after her mother's favorite cow, she told me. Anyway, they lived in an apartment, I guess in Marin City, and they both were making about $60 a week, which was very good pay in those days. And they came to me one day and asked if they could borrow some money from me because they wanted to make a down payment, the first month payment on another apartment, better apartment. I said, well, don't you have any money? They said, no, we don't have a cent. I said, well, you both got paid last Friday. What did you do with it? Oh, we spent it. They had been working there at that time for a couple of years. They didn't have a cent. From paycheck to paycheck, they spent it all.
A lot of these people were people who hadn't had any money to spend.
I don't think that those people had enough money to spend. I guess they just went wild when they got their paychecks.
Actually, your money got you a little house, right? You were able to.
Well, it wasn't just my. You say mine? Now, how am I going to make this a sentence?
Once you're working, you can afford to do some things you couldn't do too. Didn't it change your life?
The money changed my life, but what really changed my life was being a defense worker, because I was able to buy one of the last houses built in Belvedere, just a little house on the Belvedere Lagoon. They were built as summer cottages, and ours cost $5,000 instead of $4,500 because we had an extra room, a little bedroom for me. And because they were built after, they had been started before Pearl Harbor, but they were finished after Pearl Harbor. And because of that, only defense workers could buy them. And it happened, we had to get out of the house we'd been renting for 20 years. And everything just fell into place. I bought this house on the Belvedere Lagoon for $5,000.
You said that on the job in general, people got along well, and in fact, you were supervising men at different times. But you told me there were a couple of incidents where men had trouble working with women. It wasn't all smooth, was it?
Most things went smoothly, I thought, in the shipyard. But I became a welder Leadman because one of the man who had the crew couldn't stand having all those women on his crew anymore. I think I'd been on his crew for about 2 weeks. This was in the summer of 42. And I wasn't even a journeyman welder. I was a very new welder. But he heard that I had been a teacher. And he came to me one day and he asked me if I would take his crew. And I said, well, I can't do that. And he said, oh, yes, you can. He said, it's easy. I said, well, why do you want to leave? He said, well, I can't stand working with these women 1 minute longer. He said, I want to go down to the other end of the yard and never see any of you again. So he spoke to the foreman, and he left, and I became the Leadman.
But apart from that, in terms of the actual on-the-job men and women working together, there weren't a lot of tensions, were there?
I never saw any tension at all. Of course, maybe I was not very perceptive. Maybe I was wrapped in my own thoughts and the things that I was doing, but I certainly never felt anything myself, and I never saw anything myself that had to do with the men disliking having the women there. Now, probably that did happen in isolated incidents, but I never saw it.
And what about, would you ever see any tension between white workers who had never worked with black people before? Was that a
I
problem?
I never saw any tension between the whites and the blacks. I don't think there was any. I never heard of any either. We all got along beautifully. I admired the blacks. Good Lord, they could work so long without taking a break. I remember those great big brawny ship fitters swinging their sledgehammers. I thought, how did they get so strong? But we all got along very well, I thought.
And everybody pulled their own weight there, right?
Not necessarily, no.
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 Always be some.
We had a ship fitter boss. He was a foreman. I don't think he knew anything about ship fitting. And whenever there was something that needed to be done that was different, anything that had to be built, a new jig or something like that, he took a vacation. And his leadman did the job. That happened.
And when you were actually the lead person on the crew, you had men working for you, didn't you?
Yes.
Did they?
Don't call me a lead person. I was a lead man.
A lead man.
Yes.
Did men mind having a woman as a?
Not that I know of.
They didn't
Never
slow
said
down or
anything. No.
Get sick or? I said lead person because I couldn't remember what the word was. Let's cut for a minute. Like learning about this country and working with people from all over the country.
Well, I have always told people that I got my education in the shipyard. I had been through college, 5 years of college, and I'd been teaching for 2 years. And I didn't know anything about the United States and the people that lived in it. I suppose Marin County was an isolated bit of nice kind of life. And of course, in Galt, I ran into the migratory workers. But still, the shipyard was an experience that really opened my eyes. We had people from all over the country, from all walks of life. We had people who couldn't read. I didn't know anybody couldn't read in this country, but there were lots of them who couldn't. People who never earned any money before. They just flocked in. And it was a really valuable education. I went in a very shy person. And I came out, I don't know what the opposite of shy is, but I was not shy anymore, I'll tell you that.
It really gave you a sense about what this country is really about.
What it was about then. Yes. It gave us a sense of what this country was about then. Not necessarily now.
No, it's different now. Okay, let's cut. I think we're...
Tell Rick.
Yeah.
Well, the plan of the shipyard was...
Hang on a second, I interrupt you. Go ahead.
Begin again?
Yeah.
Okay. The plan of working in the shipyard was that the steel came in at one end. It was cut into various shapes, sizes, or pieces, or just left in one great big piece. Went to the plate shop where the smaller parts were assembled. From there to the sub-assembly shop, or the skids, which were outside. The sub-assembly was covered. Thank goodness, because it rained a lot. And there they were, the smaller parts were put into bigger sections, and the biggest sections were made out on the hulls. So in welding, you would be welding pieces together, joining big, thick pieces of metal, usually, with your welding rod. And then from the sub-assembly shop or the skids, the huge parts of the ship would be taken by gantry cranes to the hulls, where they would be assembled and made into a real honest-to-goodness ship. And then would come that most exciting moment of all, when they launched it. And this great big thing that you had been working on just sitting there. They were really beautiful. Honestly, there's nothing as pretty as a ship. And there would be the usual ceremonies and the fancy ladies with their hats and the bottle of champagne and all of that kind of stuff. And then you'd hear them yelling, burn one, burn two. What they were doing was burning away the things that were holding the ship on the ways. And you never knew what exact moment it was going to go. And all of a sudden, there'd be a big shudder. The whole ship seemed to just shudder. It's the only way I can describe it. And then she'd sail down the ways and out into the bay. And the first time I saw launching, I thought, oh my golly, if they let go of her, she's going right into my house, because my house was right across the bay from where the ways where they were launched. And then she'd go a little way and then kind of bounce up, and she'd be sitting there. Of course, the ship wasn't finished on the ways. It then went to the outfitting dock to get all the rest of the stuff, but it was essentially a ship when it left the ways. And I will say a launching is the most exciting thing I've ever seen in my life.